Are we good to go? Is that a countdown I see? That means go. So we're on now. Another seamless opening. Here it is Tuesday night. It's time for our second look study. And we'll be looking at some things we've dealt with on Sunday mornings here recently. If you're joining us online, we welcome you. Unfortunately, you cannot access our study guide, but I think everybody here has got one. Another unfortunate thing is we're going to give away a prize to a good student today, a moon pie. And so if you're yes, a moon pie. So if you're watching online, too bad for you, because there's no way you can win it. But some lucky kid will win it here. So let's take a look. Okay, I'm going to just declare we are now officially behind because we're going to deal with something that we talked about a week or so ago, a couple of weeks ago now, that really it needs some fleshing out. But that's going to put us behind because we won't have time, I don't think, to get to anything that we talked about on Sunday. And the genius of this study is supposed to be that we'll talk about on Tuesday night in greater depth what we dealt with on Sunday, but we're not going to be able to do that. So we're officially behind. Well, that's the way it goes. We will continue to talk about ways that the Old Testament is used in the book of Revelation, remembering that John never does what some other New Testament writers do. He never has a direct quote that he has some kind of a tagline to, as said in the prophet Isaiah or something else. He never does that. He never quotes a whole verse, but he uses bits and pieces, dribs and drabs, what I call bits, and he repurposes them. And it's very probable that he does this because he sees things that he has no vocabulary for, nor do we. And so he takes what he knows from the Hebrew Scriptures, and that is filtered, of course, through his Second Temple Judaism, which is rife with all kinds of imagery and metaphors and picture language. We're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, that sort of thing. What we think of as the apocryphal books or the pseudepigraphical books, the things that did not make the cut and get into our Bible. Most of them for very good reason, but it's still the literature that was circulating, that John would have been familiar with, that Jesus, Paul, others would have. It was just the soup they were swimming in. And so he makes use of all of that to try and convey to us what he is seeing or has seen in a series of visions. And so that's why we're looking at the ways he uses the Old Testament. Before we push in, and we're really just going to look at two verses tonight that we touched on, but we need to come back to, dealing with the keys of death and Hades. But before we do that, and before we talk about how he came to write this book or the way it was written, just want to reemphasize the main themes in the book of Revelation. It is a revelation of Jesus Christ. We know that from John's experience. He gives us a lived object lesson. Jesus is revealed to him, and he sees Jesus as he's always been, but John has never seen him before. Now his eyes are going to be open. He's going to have an experience. We're going to come back to that experience that he has in a minute. And he will experience Jesus in a new way. It will be an unveiling, a revelation. And so we get it through his lived experience, that it's a revelation of Jesus like we've never seen him before. But also it's the very first phrase in the whole book. It is a revelation of Jesus Christ. So it's not a revelation of an end-time calendar, and some people try and use it that way. I believe that's probably an improper use. However, it does touch on several key themes. I've kind of boiled it down to three essentials, main themes in the Revelation. Number one, that God is in control. However you choose to read it, by whatever end-time scheme, if you want to adopt that, and there are a number of different interpretive devices that can be used, and there are different schools of thought about how it progresses, how it relates to history, either ancient history, John's time, or our history, or future history. However you do it, the main message is that God is in control. And again, whatever scheme you favor, that should still be an overriding thought, that God is in control. We're going to see in Revelation things get out of control, or seeming to be out of control. From the human perspective, it seems chaotic on a whole lot of levels, but God is still in control. The second main theme is that Jesus will return. We see that again and again and again. In the Revelation, the way I favor reading it is it may be, and I say may be because I don't think you can say some of this with a lot of certainty, but it seems to me that one of the ways it could be looked at is it's telling essentially the same story over and over again, at least 3 or 4 different ways with different images. And the story that it's telling is Jesus will return. He does come back. So that is, you can bank on that. It is talking about that. The other is that you're either an overcomer or you will be overcome. And that's a phrase, the overcomer, the promise to the overcomer is a phrase that shows up several times in the book, most especially at the end of the letters to the 7 churches. Even each of them will get a promise for overcoming. If you overcome, this will happen. And I wanted to look at one of them tonight at the Laodicean church that we talked about on Sunday. We won't get to because it's an extremely interesting promise. It involves thrones. And not only will you have a throne, but you will sit on his throne, Jesus' throne, which is a throne that he got from his Father. So that's pretty exciting stuff. Anyway, that's one of the promises to overcomers. Again, we'll not get to it tonight. But you're either an overcomer or you will be overcome by events. By sin? Just by events. You'll be bowled over. If you're not an overcomer, you'll be overcome. And that, it seems to me, is a pretty good life philosophy, even if we aren't living in the tribulation time or some other time future to come. I'm either going to overcome this or I'm going to be overcome by it. And that is certainly a message there. In other words, what I take that to mean, that you'll either be an overcomer or you'll be overcome, is that salvation is available to all who want it. That rescue, that's what salvation means. Rescue, protection. It is available to all who want it. And that is not a message for end times only. However you measure the end times, it's a measure for every time. That salvation is available to anybody who wants it. Okay? So there, I just say that again and let you get it down on your study guide so we don't lose focus here of where the book is actually going. Let's talk for a minute about how this book was written. It's a record, John's record. Is it a record or is it a vision? Or a series of visions? John is thinking back, we know, into the Old Testament to try and deal with some of this. But is it a record, John's record, or is it a vision? The answer is both. When John has and we've got to keep this in mind, when John receives a vision in the book of Revelation, and he receives several, he's not writing during the vision. He's in some kind of a vision-like state, if you want to think of it as a trance or something like that. But he wants to describe the things that he sees, and he's been given that mandate, write what you see, okay? But it's not like he's sitting there with notepad while the vision is going and he's jotting down like a court reporter or a stenographer with longhand. or shorthand. It's not like that. He experiences something, and then after the fact, he sets it to writing. He puts it down in writing. And in the process of putting it down in writing, setting it to writing, it's going to dawn on him either because of what he knows in terms of the Old Testament, his previous worldview, his theology, either because of that or because he will be prompted by the Spirit of God, he's going to start to make connections. Okay? Now, we don't know exactly how that whole process worked in his case, but it would have been something like that. So in other words, the question is this John's record or is this the vision? Well, it's both. He gets the experience and then he sets it down the best he can. And he's trying to figure out the best way to say what he's got to say and to say it in the most memorable way. We've talked about some of those devices that he uses. He's got to relate the experience that he's having to his audience. That's his job. Write what you see. So how best to do that? It seems that he's inspired by God for some of the images, but some of it, it's up to him. And that really gives you a good feel for how Scripture is inspired. Inspiration of the Scriptures, and the Bible talks about that. And it uses a word that is part of the word groups that include the word pneuma. We know a pneuma word really well, pneumonia. It has to do with your respiratory, right? Breath. Pneuma is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word ruach, which could mean wind or breath. And we're told that Scripture is inspired. It's God-breathed. It's the breath of God. Well, with John's case here, we're getting a pretty good idea, pretty good feel for how inspiration works, okay? In other words, inspiration is human and supernatural. It's both. Both. John gets a vision, that's supernatural. He's told to write it, and his writing and some of the images that he uses, that would be the human part. So it's not a case where the Bible writers are sitting there with a steno pad and, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Say that back again. It's not like that. And it's not like John is getting a vision and then he says, hold on while I catch that. But after the fact, then he's got to produce something that will be understandable to his audience. So that's that interplay of the human and the supernatural. It's both. And one does not cancel out the other. Just because it's supernatural doesn't mean there's no human element involved. There is. The Bible says that the Scriptures are inspired and that God inspired holy people to do the writing. So there's a human element and there's a supernatural element, but they don't cancel each other out. One doesn't cancel the other. And there are people that will say, well, it's all supernatural, so there was no human involved here. Well, that's not quite true. And there will be people on the Christian end of the spectrum that will say that, the faith end of the spectrum, that it's all God. Well, not quite, because there's a human too. And then there will be people on the non-faith end of it that will say it's all human, that there's no God involved. Well, that's not true either. It's both. And neither cancels the other out. So what we get with John in Revelation, the way he produces this document, is a real good tutorial. It's a bird's eye view of how inspiration kind of happens. Okay? Let's take a look. And we touched on it a couple weeks ago, but we need to linger longer on it. Revelation 3:7 and Revelation 1:17 through 18. And in these, there's going to be a discussion of keys. the keys of death and the keys of Hades. Some of our Bibles say hell. That's not quite right. It's the Greek word Hades, which is a little more nuanced than that. The idea of Hades did not carry with it necessarily punishment, but it was a place. We're going to see it's more than a place, but it's the abode of the dead. You could also think of it, and the Old Testament thought of it, the word Sheol, as simply the grave or the underworld, which simply meant, it didn't necessarily mean a big cavernous place down there where there's a civilization, like Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote about in the center of the earth or any, not necessarily that. Underworld simply means not on top of the soil, under the soil, okay? The grave. So we're going to take this kind of apart tonight. Take a look in Revelation 3:7. To the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, the words of the Holy One, the true one, who has the key of David, okay, so there's our phrase, key, in this case, key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens. Okay, what John has done here is he's taken some Old Testament pictures and he's repurposing them. And that's what we're going to run down here tonight. Now, we loop back to Revelation 1, where we saw our first case of the keys. And in Revelation 1, back up to verse 17, 18. And when I saw him, this is John's testimony of his initial vision, okay? His initial revelation of Jesus. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, fear not, I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive evermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. Okay? So again, we've got several things here that he's pulled from the Old Testament, just bits, and he's pulled them all together. And we're going to see where he got them, we're going to see why he does it, and along the way it'll help us to understand what's involved with this whole keys of death and Hades thing. Okay? Again, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, but he laid his right hand on me, saying, fear not, I am the first and last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I'm alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. Now look at that phrase, I have the keys to death and Hades. Okay? It refers to something. What it's telling us, first and foremost, is that after rising from death, because that's why you get in this passage that talks about the keys of death and Hades, you also get these mentions of coming back. What it's pointing out is that after rising from death, Jesus is king of the cosmos, king of the whole universe, everything. Okay? It's cosmic sovereignty is what this picture, the keys, is meant to convey. That he is the king, and the king has the keys. Okay? Now, and Jesus gets the keys. Why? Because it follows the act of him rising from the dead. I want us to look at a couple phrases, a couple words here. We're going to zero in on death and Hades, okay? And to think about it the way John wants us to think about it, by using the phrase keys of death and Hades, we have to look at it, get a little wonky with the language, the grammar. Because what we've got here with both of these phrases, death and Hades, in the construction of this sentence, the keys, as it says, the keys to death and Hades, or the keys of death and Hades, is you've got a phrase that is known as a genitive. Now, you don't need to worry about what's involved there, but you can read a genitive phrase two different ways. You can read it objectively, it can be an objective genitive, or it can be a possessive genitive, okay? Now, don't worry a whole lot about that, but what that means is you can translate it a couple of different ways. It's got a richness to it, intentionally. You could translate it the keys to death and Hades, okay? And some of your Bibles may do that. The keys to death and Hades. In which case, it's a place. Death and Hades is a place, okay? Or death is a place and Hades is a place. You could look at it that way. That would be looking at it objectively. If you looked at it possessively, then you could translate it, the keys belong to death and Hades. Now, this is where it gets interesting. And this is this is certainly why John used the passages that he did, is because if you say it could be the keys belong to death and Hades, then you're dealing in the area of personification. In other words, death and Hades are not just places, they are places, but they're not just places, they're entities. Okay? They're spiritual entities. Okay? That's the track we're going to pursue here, because that's where it gets really interesting. Okay? The Hebrew word for death is the word mot, M-O-T, mot. Okay? And that phrase, that use of the word, is really rich in Hebrew. Okay? Again, death and Hades can be places, but it can also be a personification. Okay? And you get both in the book of Revelation. It's shown as a place, but it's also shown as a person, an entity. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's another. Okay? We're going to focus on the personification. Okay? So, the Hebrew word for death is mot. Interestingly enough, in an ancient kingdom just north of Israel, they have a god called Mot. He is the god of death. So there, death is personified. All right? Among some of the ancient Near Eastern people, it's another one of the Elohim. It's another one of the gods. It's part of the pantheon of gods. All right? Mot, death. So there, in their setting, it's very much personified. Okay? Now, in the Ugaritic, it's called the Ugaritic, the Ugarit area. In that particular scheme, where Mot is a god, he's not a main god. It doesn't, at least no evidence has been found that there was a cult devoted to him like there was to Baal or some of the others. In other words, he wasn't necessarily worshipped. He didn't have a following, but he was a figure. And in their mythology, Mot is one of the main enemies of Baal. Now, we know Baal a lot. He shows up. He's a problem for the people of Israel. There's always a temptation for them to run after Baal. Baal was a Canaanite god that was very widespread. A lot of the different people groups knew about Baal. And in some of them, like in among the Philistines, he was the king of the gods. Baal means master. And Mot is his enemy. Mot is always his enemy. Alongside a sea god, they conspire to take down Baal. Okay? So, Mot is a god, part of the pantheon of gods in the Ugaritic. He's the enemy of Baal. He often does battle. There are stories about Mot doing battle with Baal, the chief of the gods, and that happens a lot. And in their mythology, at one point, Baal loses to Mot. He loses to death. Okay? And because he loses, he has to go to the underworld. He loses to death, and he has to go to the grave, Sheol, the underworld, the place where the dead go. Okay? Now here's a case where death is personified, but the grave, Sheol, is a place. And because Baal loses to Mot in this battle, in this struggle, he has to go to the underworld, Sheol, where Mot also lives. That is Mot's home. That's his place in their scheme. It's where he lives, and it's a place of decay and destruction. It's described in their mythology as dark and muddy. Not a very unpleasant place, okay? And Baal has to go there. The main characteristic of Mot in their system is that he is a voracious consumer. And he mostly consumes and has an appetite for gods and men. Mot, death, will eat gods and men. Okay, that's the way he's described. So he overcomes Baal. Baal has to go to the underworld, which is unpleasant. It's a muddy place, decay, destruction, all of that. And so he's a demonic force. He's a spirit force, a malevolent spirit force that has got to be held in check. Mot, death. Okay? There aren't very many images that have been found of Mot, but the few that have been found is he is a god, a demon, who's always carrying a scepter. Well, what's a scepter mean? In other words, he's a ruler. Okay? So he has some kind of rulership. In this case, over the dead. Okay? Take a look in Hosea 13:14. And somebody else jump ahead to 1 Corinthians 15:55, which is a much more familiar verse. You will recognize it right away. But 13:14 of Hosea, what's it say? Somebody read it for us.
Shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where are your thorns? O Sheol, where is your sting? Compassion will be hidden from my sight.
It's in Hosea, but it won't be the last time that it'll be mentioned. I shall ransom them from the power of Sheol, and I shall redeem them from death. So here you've got, the order is reversed, but you've got death and the grave, death and Sheol, death and the underworld, death and the place of the dead. Okay? And it says, your version said, where are your thorns? Could be plagues. Where is your sting? Compassion is hidden from my eyes. Now, you've heard this language before. Somebody read 1 Corinthians 15:55 for us. In 15, Paul is talking about the resurrection of Jesus, that we will know the same resurrection, bodily resurrection, physical resurrection. That the goal of this thing is not just the salvation of our soul, but it's the redemption, the reclaiming of our bodies. We receive a glorified body, a spiritual body. And though it is a spiritual body, it is not an immaterial body. It's a body like unto his body, which was very physical. But it had properties that were different. It seems to have had an added dimension that allowed it to move instantaneously, place to place, appear, disappear through hard surfaces, etc., etc. But still eat, okay? that was the body of Jesus, and Paul is making a case that the end goal here is not just the salvation of our souls, but the redemption of our bodies. Our bodies will be reclaimed. And so he's describing what our bodies are going to be like. Somebody read 1 Corinthians 15:55. Very familiar verse to most of us.
Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?
In the Old King James, death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Right? Where did Paul borrow that from? Hosea. Okay? And in the Hosea passage, you've got death and Sheol, death and grave, are personified. They're not just places. And when Paul borrows that passage for his 1 Corinthians 15:55, he uses the same language, you see? The sting and all of that, death, Sheol, personified. And death and the underworld are portrayed there as entities that can be spoken to, in Hosea now, and that Paul borrows. You can speak to them because they are persons, personalities, entities, okay, spiritual entities. You can speak to them, they can be spoken to, they can be teased because that's part of the Hosea passage. They're being teased. Death and Sheol are being teased. They're being mocked. Well, why? Because they're personalities. They're entities. Okay? They're spirit beings. What we've got here is a clear case, and we could spend more time on Hosea, but we won't. But we've got a clear case of what's called anthropomorphic language. Anthropo means man, human. And morphic, like metamorphosis, is to change. Okay? So we've got the language of embodiment here that's used of these spirit beings, but we use human images or human language, human pictures to try and explain it. In other words, they're personified. You get Sheol personified, the grave as a person, as an entity, and you get death the same way. Take a look in Isaiah 5:14. Somebody else, and we don't want to linger long over these, but I want to show you how Sheol was personified here, but we're going to come back with even more in a minute. But these are easy. 5:14 of Isaiah, Proverbs 1:12, Proverbs 27:20. I'll leave you to look up the rest when you get home. But somebody read Isaiah 5:14 for us.
Therefore hell has enlarged herself and opened her mouth without measure, and their glory and their multitude and their pomp, and he that rejoices shall descend into it.
Okay. Who has opened its mouth?
It says hell, death,
The grave. The place of the dead has opened its mouth to swallow its victims. So you get this personification language, this anthropomorphic language for the grave. How about Proverbs 1:12? Proverbs does this a bunch. I could have listed a whole bunch more. But Proverbs 1:12, somebody read that for us.
Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, and whole like those who go down to the pit.
There we go. Sometimes it's referred to as the pit, the grave. Well, you can see why. Because you dig a pit. And that's where you put the body. So they go down to that. But here you've got Sheol and the pit are personified. They have mouths. They swallow. They have this mechanism. Okay? So it's not just a place, it's personified. Take a look at one more, and then you can look at the rest of those when you get home. 27:20, another proverb, very descriptive.
Death and destruction are never satisfied, and neither are human eyes.
There you go. Death and destruction, death, the grave, death, Sheol, death, the pit, never satisfied. Like people are never satisfied, right? So there you get the language, and there you get it personified. Now, in the Old Testament, everyone goes to Sheol, goes to the grave. Everyone. Now, there are a couple notable exceptions, Enoch and Elijah, but they're the exceptions that prove the rule. Everyone in the Old Testament, that's where everyone goes. Good, bad, ugly, you wind up in Sheol, in the grave. Now, it doesn't get a lot of description. We're going to see in a moment that in the Greek world, it got more description. But in the Old Testament, it doesn't get a lot of description. But it's a place of no activity. It's the grave, okay? That's where everyone goes, no exception. Because, why? Because everyone dies. Everybody dies. And that's where you go when you die. Into the pit, into Sheol, okay? So there it's used as a place. But you're kind of getting the flavor of how this is all working. And in the Old Testament, there is a promise of escape, but it never happens it never happens in the Old Testament. You never see a case where somebody gets out of the grave in the Old Testament. You never see a case of that. One notable exception is a guy who comes to life by touching the bones of the prophet Elijah. Okay? Another notable exception is the little boy who dies. But again, those are things that prove the rule. Nobody really escapes, and after all, they didn't live forever. They died again, like Lazarus. Okay? So there is no escape. Everybody dies. Everyone goes to Sheol because everybody dies. And in the Old Testament, you get this promise of escape someday, but it never happens to anybody in the Old Testament. Nobody gets out. Once in Sheol, nobody gets out. Not in real time. There's a promise, but it doesn't really happen to anybody in history. Okay? So what that means is that death and the grave hold you prisoner. Again, go back to the personification thing. These entities, death and the grave, they hold you as a prisoner, like a prisoner. Now, we're going to really see that and really see it personified. Skip 2 Samuel 22, 5 through 6. I'll let you do that at home. That's a fun one. But somebody turn to Psalm 18, 4 through 5. And we're going to see different characteristics of entities, of personalities when it comes to death. Okay? Psalm 18, 4 through 5.
The cords of death entangle me. The torrents of destruction overwhelm me. The cords of the grave coil around me. The snares of death confronted me.
Okay? So how is death personified here? Again, playing on the prisoner idea, it uses cords and snares, things to keep you confined, to hold you so that there's no release. In other words, you're bound. Once they get their claws on you, you're bound. And so there you see a picture of death personified, binding people. A place wouldn't do that. personality would. Take a look at Psalm 55:4. This is all the reasons that John borrows some of this stuff, okay? It's very rich. 55:4 of Psalms. Who's got that?
My heart is severely pained within me, and the terror of death have fallen upon me.
So what's death doing there? It's terrorizing people. It's scaring people to death. It's a personality, okay? How about Habakkuk 2:5? Death personified. Who's got it?
Indeed, because he transgresses by blind, he is a proud man, and he does not stay at home, because he enlarges his desire as hell, and he is like death and cannot be satisfied.
Okay, so there you've got death and Hades, grave, pit, underworld, and they're both described as never satisfied. Like a greedy person, like a hoarder, never satisfied. Never satisfied. So, and there are many more. But you're beginning to see why John drew on this idea, and he talked about keys, the keys of death and Hades, death and the grave. They're personalities, they're entities. In this case, never satisfied. Let's take a look at Sheol, grave. Sheol is the Old Testament word. Hades is the New Testament word. It means grave, the underworld, the pit. And we're going to see it personified. Let's go to our old friend Job. Job 24:19. How is it personified there? Grave is an entity. It's a personality.
Drought and heat consume the snow waters, so does Sheol those who have sinned.
Okay? What's he doing? He's seizing his victims. He's grabbing them. I mean, he's pulling them down. This is the grave now. So he's personified there. How about Proverbs 27:20? We looked at it a moment ago, but look at it again, and let's see how that Sheol is personified. 27:20 of Proverbs.
Hell and destruction are never full, so the eyes of man are never satisfied.
Okay, never satisfied. It's insatiable. Do you ever look across big cemeteries and just think, my goodness, people have been dying for a long time. There's a lot of people. You can drive down the 405 and see the one military cemetery. It's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And that's just a fraction, right? It's been going on since humans began. Well, it's never satisfied. Never says enough. Never satisfied. Take a look at the Song of Solomon, 8:6. You wouldn't expect to find this in a love poem, but here it is.
Put me like a seal over your heart, like a seal on your arm, for love is as strong as death. Jealousy is as severe as Sheol. Its flames are flames of fire, the flame of the Lord.
Talking about love, talking about jealousy, maybe it's opposite, but they have an irresistible power, love and jealousy, like death. Death has an irresistible power. That's what's conveyed there. How about Isaiah 5:14? This gets real personified. This is very much like a person, a very bad person. Isaiah 5:14.
Therefore Sheol has enlarged its throat and opened its mouth without measure. And Jerusalem's splendor, her multitude, her din of revelry, and the jubilant within her, descend into it.
Did you ever see those National Geographics or nature documentaries where the snake just, it opens up its gullet, just unbelievably big. It widens its throat to take in the animal. That's kind of the picture here. The grave is the same way. It opens its mouth, it distends its gullet, its throat, in order to feed on its victims. Oh, more coming? I can get bigger. I can get bigger. I can eat them all. I mean, this is all super graphic language here. What it points to is that there is a long history of death and grave as places and as persons, as entities. We often just confine our discussion of death, grave as places, you know? Not so. They hold you prisoner because they're not just places, they're also personalities. They're also malevolent, ugly, terrible, horrid personalities, demonic. Okay? And we could go on. I mean, there are verses that talk about them having a belly and all kinds of stuff. Let's take a minute before we wrap this up. That's the way it's talked about in the Old Testament, and that's the sort of thing you find in Second Temple literature, but also in a lot of Greek and Roman literature. And the Roman literature, of course, borrows from the Greeks. But in Homer, which is one of the earlier Greek works, you get a lot of mention of Hades, the grave, and he's personified as the god of the underworld. Now, they have a worked out system where he's kind of the governor down there and the gatekeeper. He is a brother of Zeus in the Greek system. He is horrible. He's described as in Homer. He's described as horrible, and he is called in Homer's work, the Odyssey and the Iliad. He's the most hated of all the gods. When the Odyssey and the Iliad talk about different figures, they usually have a tagline, and that was probably because it helped people to memorize, and then be able to recite. And so when you talked about Achilles, it was always swift-footed Achilles. Okay? When you talked about Odysseus, it was always crafty Odysseus. When you talked about Helen, it was always the fair-faced Helen. When you talked about the ocean, it was always the wine-dark sea. And when you talked about Hades, it was always the most hated of the gods. Okay? He's the god of the underworld. He's pictured as a judge of the dead. He's not only a god of the underworld, but he is the realm of the underworld. So they have the idea also that Hades is a place, but it's also a personality. Okay? And the dead are often referred to in Homer as going into the house of Hades, his house. They depict a river or a lake that is a boundary between the dead and the living. And a ferryman takes you from the land of the living to the underworld, to the house of Hades, to the gates of Hades, it's sometimes called. Jesus is teeing off on that when he stands outside of Philippi and he sees this cave in the side of the cliff that the locals said was the gate of hell or the gate of Hades. And that's where he says, I will build my church and the gates of death, Hades, will not prevail against it. Okay? He's teeing off of that. Death is in the Greek system is portrayed as, is personified as a demon or a monster from the underworld. That's Hades. Okay? So enough of that. So it's kind of just kind of floating through the atmosphere, all through the ancient world. And as I said, there's a long, long history of death and the grave as places, but also as persons, as entities, as both. There's a long history of both. The death and Hades in the scripture, though, let's get back to our friend John and Revelation 1 and Revelation 3. The whole idea is that Christ is going to descend to this realm. He will defeat death and Hades. And in these passages, John sees them as personalities, demonic personalities, some kind of rival God personalities. And that is their domain. But at some point, Jesus will go down there, wherever there is, because it is a place, but it's also a personality, and he will defeat them. And so we're talking about spiritual warfare, though. So what we've got, and we wrap it up with this, is they have been dethroned. That's what John is conveying when he says Jesus has the keys to death and Hades. Whether you take it as a place or the keys that belong to death and Hades, he has in effect taken them away. He's removed the keys. They're no longer the owners of these keys. And that's the image that John is using when he talks about Jesus has the keys of death and Hades. They belong to them, and I've taken them away, and you don't have to be afraid of them anymore. In other words, they have no power over us, death and the grave, and we are prisoners that have been allowed to go free. That's what John is doing when he borrows these images of these places that are also personalities. He's aware of that. His audience is aware of that. And so it's a pretty rich picture that he's laying out for us. And when we see what he's doing, and that's what he's doing, it adds all kind of meaning to what Jesus has done for us. He's taken their keys away. He's taken their authority away. And they have no power over us anymore. Amen. Isn't that good? Isn't that good? So that's it. That is it.